And we're back. Okay guys, this is a really fun part. We get to paint. You don't need to dampen your brush or your sponge for your first coat. Some people still do. Some people do every time. If you want to, that's fine. You can. The reason I don't is because I want as much full coverage on that first coat as I can get without putting on too much paint. And when you dampen your brush or your sponge, you do thin the paint out a little and reduce the coverage a little. Well, I want full coverage. I want to work as little as possible. So either way, there's no right or wrong. This is how I do it. All right, so here's what we're gonna need for this lesson, right? Your paint. So I'm using in the navy, dark blue, Dixie Belle in the navy. It's my favorite color right now. I'm going to use the Dixie Belle applicator sponge. You may have this, or you may have one of the yellow ones from Amazon that I mentioned before. There'll be a link on my website. And I'm going to use the Dixie Belle brush called the Mini. So even when I paint with a sponge, I like to have a brush handy to get inside nooks and crannies and curves and the spots that the sponge doesn't really get. So go ahead and shake up your paint really well. Always shake up your paint really well. You may prefer to stir it. Make sure your lid's on well. I already shook it quite a bit before, but I'm going to shake it a little again because I want to remind you that's really important to shake your products or stir. So you may prefer to paint out of like a plastic bowl or a paper plate or something. You can pour your paint onto a container. I like to just paint right out of my jar most of the time. So I'm going to just move my brush aside for now. So why do I use the sponge? I use the sponge because it's quick and easy and it gives a really smooth surface without brush strokes, but mostly because it's just really quick and easy. So I use it mostly on flatter surfaces, but you can kind of squish it into some of the detail work and really just make really quick work out of the paint job. So dry sponge, dip it right into the paint jar, get a nice load on there, and I'm going to start with the top of this table. I usually like to start in the back so that you know, if I put the paint up in the front and then I'm reaching back, I'm more likely to get my sleeve on the paint. And I like to kind of not get paint on this shirt if at all possible. I pretty much have paint on almost all my clothes. So you just give it a few swipes and then dip it and go again. Swish it around here. I'm kind of pushing it into these grooves just a little bit, so I don't have to get the brush out. But I mean, I will, but it just, the more you can do with the sponge, the easier the paint job is overall. So now at this point, I'm just going to keep going. And now I'm going to back the table up just a little bit here and get the bottom shelf here. You can see how quick and easy that is, you guys? And you can go different directions, okay? Because you're not going to have brush strokes, and also because your final strokes, you'll want to go like one direction. So I'm going vertically here in the edges to kind of push the paint in, but then I'm just going to kind of give it horizontal swipes to kind of give it one smooth back and forth direction. Okay? So never ever ever expect full coverage on your first coat, you guys. Okay? It rarely happens. It happens sometimes, especially if you're going for like a kind of a farmhouse distressed finish. But 2 coats, almost always, okay? So with that in mind, don't go too thick on your first coat. Oops, sorry, you couldn't really see that one. Let me make sure you can see this one. Okay, wait. Oh, sorry. Okay, this one. Okay. So again, with that in mind, always plan for 2 coats and don't go too heavy on your first coat and try to get full coverage by overloading with paint. Now inside here, there's little spots that just in those corners I'm not quite getting. So I'm gonna take my brush and I'm just gonna dip it in just a little bit. Just kind of stab inside those corners, those 4 corners, just a little bit. Just that easy, you guys. And so now I'm going to switch back to my sponge. And I had absolutely meant to turn this upside down and paint it upside down first so I could get underneath here and underneath here first, and I forgot. So whether or not you paint the under part of a surface, that may or may not show, is up to you. I think what you need to think about is just like, is it possible it'll show? Like, what if you had this little table on the ground and you dropped, one of your guests dropped a quarter and she went down to get it and happened to see underneath here. Well, would you care if it was painted or not, right? So a little tiny piece like this, and now I'm switching to the brush for this little detail work right here. I can just kind of stab it on in there. A small piece like this, I don't mind doing a little extra effort to paint the undersides or the back or whatever, because it's just such a small piece. It's not going to take a lot of extra time or product, right? Now you can go over, even though I already painted up here and I moved on, it felt kind of heavy here, so I went up and just kind of swished it and I kind of missed a couple spots. It's okay, chalk paint's okay to do that with until it starts getting really dry, okay? Then it'll start to get sort of a texture. Like, think about when you're painting walls. If you're painting a wall and you miss a spot and you try to go over it 5 minutes or a few minutes later, it's going to turn it into a bad texture because that's latex paint. But chalk paint's much more forgiving. You can kind of work with it and smooth it out while it's drying to an extent. Once it starts getting really dry, then you kind of need to leave it alone and move on. But like even right here, I'm going to go back over here with the brush again. Just kind of smooth it out, even it out. Okay? And then I can move on. You do want to be careful not to get drips and runs. If you get them, it's not the end of the world unless you're trying to do one of those really super smooth pieces, right? Where it's flawless. But in a piece like this where I'm going to distress it, if I get a small drip or run, it's not that big a deal because I'm going to use sandpaper and I'm going to sand it down. So I'm using my brush to kind of stab in these little hard to get spots. Isn't this pretty? So pretty. I'm smoothing it out, just kind of working the paint a little bit. That's what the beauty of this chalk paint is, so forgiving. Making sure I get, all the way to the bottom of the feet. I'll turn around and get this side here. And again, going to my sponge, loading it up, getting this side piece here. Loading it up, kind of reaching in here. I want to be careful, I don't want to get paint on my sweater. This is like a new sweater or sweatshirt or whatever. Do you see how I'm doing these smooth strokes as my final strokes, just to sort of smooth it out and then top? Now it's a little trickier getting up inside of here And I'm gonna switch the brush for that so I can kind of get it in the crevices better. And then I'm going to have to reach all the way down in there, and I'm not going to do that with the sweater on right now, you guys, but it's going to get messy. But I'm going to reach way down in there with the, probably both the sponge and the brush, just to get inside of that pocket thingy. Can you see how quickly this first coat is going on? It's pretty amazing, isn't it? With the sponge especially. But you can do it absolutely without the sponge if you just have a brush. In fact, I'll show you that on the next side that I do here. Got a drip there, gonna catch that. It's the beauty, you can catch those drips before they dry, unlike when you're using like latex wall paint. It's really hard to catch those drips. So I'm gonna kind of get the crevices here that the sponge couldn't get very well. And now I'm going to show you the side. I'm going to do just with the brush. Okay? So I'll show you, you don't have to use the sponge. You can just use your brush. To me, it's just not quite as quick, not quite as easy, and you get brush strokes. Which I don't really mind brush strokes, but constantly like, I don't want brush strokes. You're going to be fighting a losing battle because they exist. It's just part of the art form, but you can just sort of try to smooth it out. You can use a little damp water, you know, if you want to reduce the brush strokes. Sometimes you have to really stab to get inside of the nooks and crannies. All right, you guys, I got a little bit more to do, but our time is up on this one. So stay tuned for the second coat, which I'm going to show you. Okay? All right.